Nazi regime was concerned to create a pure national community, and in order to do so, it enlisted the help of medical professionals, so doctors, physicians, psychiatrists. There was a very close alliance between doctors and between science and the state in the Third Reich.
We tend to think of Mengele being almost the only doctor in Auschwitz, and indeed he wasn't. There were scores of other doctors in Auschwitz. I use the word doctor kind of in inverted commas because these people aren't curing people, they're killing people. One of the other kind of hallmarks of Nazi medicine, if you like, is not just involuntary euthanasia and killing the incurable. It's also this appalling program of experimentation by Nazi doctors on live human beings. There was this concept called racial hygiene, which sounds basically as disgusting as it was. It's this idea that you have a race of pure people. With the Nazis, it was meant to be pure Aryans. That was the word they used for sort of kind of basically tall white people. And they didn't want their race, the Aryan race, to be sullied, if you like, by people from other races. So the whole idea of different races breeding with each other was seen as being kind of, medically totally objectionable. It was, racially unhygienic.
The Nazi regime was concerned to create a pure national community, and in order to do so, it enlisted the help of medical professionals, so doctors, physicians, psychiatrists, also demographers, population policy experts, in order to create the perfect society that it wanted to create. So it really harnessed the skills and the expertise of the medical profession.
The measures against Jewish people came up first slowly, but then more dangerous. People disappeared, and then in '42 we went into hiding. We went in hiding from Holland, where I've been born in Vienna, and when the Nazis came there, the population changed immediately. This was quite shocking and amazing. We had many non-Jewish friends, and they all turned against us. For me as a child, something I couldn't understand at all. We were Jewish, but not religious, and this was, I think, I was 9 at the time, this was a big shock for me.
Jews were not allowed to walk on the pavements, they had to walk in the gutters. Jews were not allowed to practice their professions. My father couldn't go to work anymore. At first we had to wear an armband, a white armband with a blue Star of David on it. They later changed it to a yellow star, which we had to wear. All Jews in Europe had to wear it, one in the front, one in the back. If you walked out without it, you could have been shot. They put up 10 gallows in the center of our ghetto, and they picked up 10 men either from work or from their homes, and while they gathered hundreds of people to stand by and watch it, they hung 10 men together. These gallows were never dismantled, but every now and again the procedure was repeated, and we thought it can't get any worse.
But instead, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws in September 1935, and in particular, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honour, was the law that prohibited or banned any marriages or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. And of course the point there was to prevent racial miscegenation or racial mixing.
You only had to walk into any university library in Germany and go to the medical section and see journal after journal and book after book about this whole idea of racial purity, combating hereditary diseases. And so the medical profession looked at what Hitler was doing, looked at what the Nazis were doing and going, this is great, this is exactly where medical philosophy in Germany is taking us. This is what we want to happen. You know, in other countries such as Britain and the United States, people were far more wary of this idea of kind of trying to breed out weakness. They didn't necessarily think it was that humane, because it really isn't. In 1933, there wasn't a law to stop a kind of racial intermingling, you know, and sex with people from different races. You know, the Nazis did not like this whole idea of mixed race people. And it took the blood protection law in September 1935 in Nuremberg, and that does make, you know, relationships between kind of black people and white people, between Jews and non-Jews, completely illegal. It would become a criminal act to actually, you know, if you were an Aryan, to go to bed or marry a Jew. It seems absolutely insane that, you know, the kind of reach that the Nazi Party and Nazi medics had on people's private lives. You know, surely you should be allowed to reproduce with exactly who you want. But no, the whole idea is you had to keep things racially pure. And if you have a mixed race child, that's going to be bad for Germany.
Wenn wir in der Partei durch unser aller Zutun die höchste Verkörperung des nationalsozialistischen Gedankens und Wesens verwirklichen, wird sie eine ewige und unzerstörbare Säule des deutschen Volkes und Reiches sein. Dann wird einst neben die herrliche, ruhmreiche Armee den alten, stolzen Waffenträgern unseres Volkes die nicht minder traditionsgefestigte politische Führung der Partei treten, und dann werden diese beiden Einrichtungen gemeinsam den deutschen Menschen erziehen und festigen und auf ihren Schultern tragen den deutschen Staat, das Deutsche Reich.
I remember one incident, a shoemaker that lived not far away from us. They went into him, barely made a living, and stabbed him to death. 95% they used to get drunk after their meetings. This was a party, and then they went out just beating up Jews. They used to throw stones in windows, breaking windows, and this kind of thing. But mainly the people were locked up and they were in their houses and their apartments, and everybody didn't go out at the time when they knew that they're going to have a meeting. So this was the kind of a life that you went through day after day.
It's no accident that in the SS, you know, Heinrich Himmler's kind of elite core of evil, really, there's no other way of putting it, the profession that had the most representation in the SS was the medical profession. Doctors joined the SS in their droves. One of the other kind of hallmarks of Nazi medicine, if you like, is not just involuntary euthanasia and killing the incurable, life unworthy of life, getting rid of it. It's also this appalling program of experimentation by Nazi doctors on live human beings.
Some of the most well-known of the Nazi doctors were Josef Mengele, most known at Auschwitz. Also Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who conducted freezing and high-altitude experiments, among other experiments, at Dachau. Klaus Karl Schilling, who conducted malaria experiments at Dachau. Karl Klauberg, a gynecologist at Auschwitz who used hundreds of female prisoners to conduct artificial insemination and mass sterilization. And Karl Vernet, who was involved in hormone research and was particularly interested in experimenting on homosexual men to see if he could cure them.
Today, there are a lot of people who regard, frankly, experiments on animals, morally objectionable. Well, how about if you were kind of experimenting on living human beings? And that is what takes place in so many concentration and extermination camps all over the Third Reich. One of the things that Rasher does is that he puts people in pressure chambers, and he either increases or decreases the pressure to simulate different altitudes in which you might not have any oxygen, to see what pilots could cope with. And there is footage. You can see these poor men, usually, and they're in agony because the pressure is either too little or too much in these chambers, and their bodies are screaming out. They're literally screaming out. Or they're put into freezing water, and they're basically made to get hypothermia. And what is this teaching anybody? If you get into freezing water, you're going to get very cold and then you're going to die. Everybody knew that before Sigmund Rascher's doing it in Dachau. How can this be medically acceptable? What, with a stopwatch, you're just going to murder someone and that's going to teach you about what the human body can endure? Where does that end? You're murdering someone. And the whole idea, Rascher would turn around and go, this person's not important, this person's unworthy of life anyway, so we might as well use his living body to gain some more data for our wonderful Nazi medical experiments. And he kills about 300 people of hypothermia alone. How is that medically useful? That's just sadism.
A wide array of medical experimentation was carried out in the Nazi concentration camps and in the death camps as well. Although we think we know quite a lot about all the sinister and extreme policies and brutalities of the Nazi regime, perhaps we understand less and know less really about the extent and the parameters and the scale of the human medical experimentation that went on in the Nazi camps. We can take a figure of about 15,000, 20% of whom were Jewish, and we know that also a lot of the other experiments were on the Sinti and Roma and on prisoners of war and other political prisoners. In terms of the scale of the experimentation, though, if we take into account large-scale nutritional project at Mauthausen concentration camp, as well as other anthropological experiments, the number can go up to an estimate of around 90,000. There was a sense that the sinister side and the brutal side perhaps would never be discovered. The doctors and the scientists engaged in carrying out the research did so with callousness, very much cold-heartedness, brutality, but also especially with impunity.
I don't think that anybody, even us in Auschwitz, wanted to feel like a piece of meat. And we have been reduced, in this case, to a mass of breathing, living cells. So much of the detail of the experiment, I still do not remember. Because the only way I could cope with it is by blocking it out. I would let my mind just take off into other directions.
Nazi medical experimentation then was a drastic set of policies in which the concentration camp prisoners were experimented on, often to the point of death. And if they didn't die during the experiments, they were often killed subsequently. This has been something of a taboo subject, so in terms of questions of medical ethics and medical research, such difficult moral questions, of course, but I think that perhaps this particular episode in a very dark history of the whole of the Third Reich is less well known and less well understood, perhaps reflecting an unwillingness to come to terms or to address what was essentially Nazi murderous science.
A friend of mine, they took her in for surgeries. She came back in the afternoon, and she was really, we thought that she lost her mind. The pain was so terrible. And she was still bleeding, when they pushed her out from the hospital. And then she said, they won't do that to me again. And she started running. Before we knew it, there she was. Yeah, she went to the fence. She couldn't tolerate the pain. What they did, they took you in and they inflicted wounds on you, and then to see how it would heal if soldiers were wounded like that, if there is a way how to.
The atrocities I witness hanging, I witness shooting, I witness terrible beatings, I witness in Buchenwald where they had a hose with a regulator and had women out there by the wall, pregnant, tried to see how much pressure it takes to make a hole. I saw the pit in Auschwitz where they made soap from people. They throw in people and took the fat and make soap for the German military. Boiling water. Big pool. There's a lot of things. Sure, you don't want to talk about it because it's, I choke or I start crying or something like that. And besides, I tell you this, except people that have been in there that saw it and witnessed it, it's very hard for people even to imagine that this was there, that this happened, Taking people and throwing them in boiling water and making soap for the German army. It's knowing the pictures are there,
Quite frankly, I don't think that any human being can ever be prepared for a place like Auschwitz, no matter how much persecution before that. I thought for a while it seemed like I am watching something that it's not really relating to me. I was numb. I closed my eyes and I thought maybe this is a nightmare. And if I close them and open them up again, maybe the whole thing will disappear.
In the wounding experiments, the doctors took perfectly healthy human beings and inflicted injuries upon them that were supposed to replicate war wounds. And they deliberately introduced foreign objects like shards of glass or splinters of wood, as well as deliberately introducing infection and bacteria to the wounds as well.
As you get older, I thought as older you get, you forget what happens. And it worked quite different. The older you get, the more it works on you, the more guilty you feel that you're alive. Or how did you really survive? Or your family becomes more important to you.
Generates the feelings of revulsion, something you just cannot imagine or take in. But the will to live is extraordinarily strong, even under these conditions. And the way I went through my period in the camps was each morning trying to do my best to still be alive that evening.
One of the most kind of brutal, pointless, sadistic Nazi experiments was carried out in Sachsenhausen concentration camp on what was ominously called the shoe testing track. Prisoners were made to walk along like 25, 30 miles a day, endlessly testing various shoes until the shoes, you know, were completely worn out. And the track had lots of different types of surfaces on it. And of course, you know, it was barbaric, because what you do is you're making them walk or run for hours at a time until these people collapse. Doesn't matter how hot it is. And of course, you know, the shoes would wear thin. It didn't matter because their feet would end up sort of bloodied. And people would just be kind of almost walked to their deaths or made to run to their deaths just to test shoes.
There is no support. There's people just absolutely full with their own misery and pain. There is no support, there is nobody, you're on your own. You're on your own with your thoughts and your pain and your misery. You're totally on your own.
Unbelievable that human beings cultivate intelligent human beings can treat other innocent people like, well, worse than cattle.
As far as the practitioners were concerned and the perpetrators, they could somehow justify to themselves the viciousness and the callousness and brutality of these experiments by somehow arguing that they were vital and important for the future of the Aryan race, for the future of science.
Even the Nazis had enough of a moral compass to know that what they were doing ultimately was wrong. Other cultures, other societies, you know, wouldn't do it. And Himmler makes this very famous speech in a place called Posen, in which he tells the assembled kind of SS there that what we've got to do, what our generation's got to do, it's distasteful, it's horrible, killing all these people is going to be a really hard and tough thing to do, but actually humanity is going to thank us, in centuries and millennia to come, that we've got rid of these people.
Die Reichtümer, die sie hatten, haben wir ihnen abgenommen, und ich habe einen strikten Befehl gegeben, den Obergruppenführer durchgeführt hat. Wir haben diese Reichtümer restlos dem Reich, dem Staat abgeführt. Wir haben uns nichts davon genommen. Einzelne, die sich verfehlt haben, die werden gemäß einem von mir gegebenen Befehl, den ich am Anfang gab, wer sich auch nur eine Mark davon nimmt, ist des Todes. Die Anzahl SS-Männer haben sich dagegen verfehlt, sind nicht sehr viele, und sie werden des Todes sein. Gnadenlos! Wir haben das moralische Recht, wir haben die Pflicht unserem Volk gegenüber, das zu tun. Dieses Volk, das uns umbringen wollte, umzubringen. Wir haben aber nicht das Recht, uns auch nur mit einem Pelz, mit einer Mark, mit einer Zigarette, mit einer Uhr, mit sonst etwas zu bereichern. Das haben wir nicht. Denn wir wollen nicht am Schluss, weil wir den Bacillus ausrotten, an den Bacillus krank werden und sterben. Da werde ich niemals zusehen, dass so etwas überhaupt nur auch eine kleine Folgenstelle bei uns eintritt oder sich festsetzt, sondern wo sich eine festsetzen sollte, werden wir sie gemeinsam ausbrennen. Insgesamt aber können wir sagen, wir haben diese schwerste Aufgabe in Liebe zu unserem Volk getan. Und wir haben keinen Schaden in unserem Innern, in unserer Seele, in unserem Charakter daran genommen.
If you don't regard the people you're experimenting on as people, it makes it so much easier.
I said to my mother, I said, I can't go on like this. I said, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to touch the wires and I'm going to kill myself because I can't go on, can't take it. And my mother said to me, she said, let's wait. You see, she believes that we're gonna be safe. She believes we're gonna survive. She believes we're gonna survive.
It's very disturbing, of course. It's very painful, you know. I live today with nights that I don't sleep, wondering what went through their mind before they're dead, what they felt, what they were thinking of. Because it didn't take very long. You know, you go into the gas chamber, it took a minute and a half, 2 minutes, you start choking. You're still a little bit conscious till you're dead. And this is a very pretty fast process, but a very slow one. When you suffer, 30 seconds is a year. And the screaming and the hollering is still ringing in my ears. It doesn't go away. It'll never go away.
Of course, Himmler, as head of the SS, was very much concerned to try and bring as much of this medical research and experimentation under his orbit.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Genauso wenig, wie wir am 30. Juni gezögert haben, die befohlene Pflicht zu tun und Kameraden, die sich verfehlt hatten, an die Wand zu stellen und zu erschießen. Wie wir darüber niemals gesprochen haben und sprechen werden. Das war so eine, Gott sei Dank, in uns wohnende Takt, Selbstverständlichkeit des Taktes, dass wir uns untereinander nie darüber unterhalten haben, nie darüber sprachen. Es hat jeden geschauert, jeder war sich klar, dass es das nächste Mal wieder tun würde, wenn es befohlen wird und wenn es notwendig ist. Ich meine, die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Fast in jeder Partei genossen. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeit. Und dann kommen sie alle die braven 80 Millionen Deutschen, jeder hat seinen anständigen Juden, sagt, alle anderen sind Schweine. Er ist ein prima Jude. Und zugesehen, es durchgestanden hat keiner. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und das durchgehalten zu haben. Und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt. Denn wir wissen, wie schwer wir uns täten, wenn wir heute noch in jeder Stadt bei den Bombenangriffen, bei den Lasten des Krieges und bei den Entbehrungen, wenn wir da noch die Juden als geheime Saboteure, Agitatoren und Hetzer hätten. Wir würden wahrscheinlich in das Stadium des Jahres 16, 17 jetzt gekommen sein, wenn die Juden noch im deutschen Volkskörper zählen.
I don't know what people did to survive, because there's nothing they could do to survive. I was lucky enough that the block Tester was the girl that was in charge of the block. She liked me, or whatever the reason, she did not give me up to the hospital. So I just lie on that bench on my own, in my misery and in my sickness. And I was not in a heap. I've never seen the hospital, but I know people were just lying there dead. So whether that helped me to recover with my own youth and strength, I really don't know.
It's very hard to say why I'm alive, because I've been dead many, many times. But I think I got something in me that I know how to survive. How to explain is very hard. Other people can do better judgment. I know in camp they used to say, Sam is like steel. The more you pound in, the harder it gets. And I got something in me for survival. I cannot explain it. According to the records, I'm dead a long time ago.
We arrived at Auschwitz, and there was some Jewish people came up the train. He said to us, whatever we do, don't say that we are sick. We stand in the line, and Mengele was sitting there, Dr. Mengele, they called him, and left, right, you know, all the announced every young woman should take the baby, give the children to the elderly, to the mothers, to the elderly people. Then when we came in the line, you know, Mengele, he said on Germany, he talked to us if we are healthy, we are sick, or something is hurting us. He talked so nice, so soft, you know, things.
One of the most notorious Nazi doctors was a man called Dr. Josef Mengele. Now, we shouldn't really even give him the title doctor, because what he did was so anti-medical, and actually the university that gave him his degree took away that degree when it discovered what he had been doing.
He became very well known on the arrivals ramp at Auschwitz. So when the trainloads of new prisoners arrived, he could be seen there in a very callous and matter-of-fact manner, directing the new arrivals straight to the gas chambers or to work duties. It seems that he sometimes spent time there in an off-duty capacity because he was interested particularly in twins and in people with dwarfism. So it seemed that he would just turn up and sort of have a look and see if he could pull any people out of the line who were of interest to him.
Families would be separated, children would be separated from their parents, and the last they would see of their parents, you know, would be them going off to this weird sort of building with a chimney coming out.
There was at different times, different doctor. There was an SS man, you know, which was a doctor. I think most of them, you know, Mengele was very much involved in the selection at that particular time. But mostly, you know, I didn't go out this far. Once you in camp, you very seldom, you see it once or twice. Later on, when I was in Auschwitz, I was able to go out more, but we didn't really pay much attention, so I cannot tell you exactly who done it at that particular time. But when I was in, Mengele was the guy that mostly was selecting people for experiments, or who's going to be in camp, or who's going to go to the gas chamber. And I'm sure he had help, because this thing was going on 24 hours a day. You know, people used to come continuously after 1940. I mean, trains, loads from all over Poland. It was just not where I lived.
Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers. And when we got out at the other end, we got our concentration camp garb, the striped jackets and skirts. And when we looked at one another, we were still the same group, but we just looked so different that we couldn't recognize each other.
And at the time you arrived there, you already knew more or less where you are, that this is an extermination camp, because the prisoners who were there before us and who shaved us and so on, they're telling you, you know, you will go to gas, you will go to gas, you have to work hard, you have to stay strong, you know, otherwise you go. And then I don't remember whether every day or several times a week there is selection. We have to stand in a row. Germans are coming, mainly Dr. Mengele himself, and they are selecting those who are no more able-bodied in their opinion, and they go to gas chambers.
What Mengele was also looking out for, and why he was particularly keen on being there to receive these new prisoners, he wanted to find twins. He was obsessed with twins. Why was he obsessed with twins? Because what you can do with twins, if you are basically an evil Nazi doctor, which is what Mengele was, is that you can experiment on one twin and then see, you know, what goes on with that twin and compare it to the still healthy twin. So you've got a kind of control, as medics call it.
I thought I was the only one. In fact, it's interesting, when in 1985, when we first found out there were other twins who survived Auschwitz, I said to Renee, I thought we were the only kids who survived. How could there be anybody else? What do you mean there are twins? So no, I had no idea that anybody else was having anything done to them. Unfortunately, a lot of memories of the hospital and the doctor's office. I seem to recall spending a great deal of time there. Also being in the hospital and being very sick. I know one time when I went to the doctor's office, they took blood from me, and it was extremely painful because it was from the left side of my neck. That's a strange thing to remember. I also remember having blood taken out of my finger, but that wasn't quite so bad. And I also remember having to sit very still for long periods to be measured or weighed, or in x-rays. I remember x-rays. And injections. I remember injections. And then I'd be sick, because then I'd be in this hospital. And I remember having a high fever, because I know they were taking my temperature. Somebody was. I really got to hate doctors.
In my case, never ever talked to me. He talked about me, he talked at me. You have to realize, Mengele did not treat us as human beings. We were just his treasured experiment subjects. We would stand by our bunk beds with our hands behind our back like little soldiers for Mengele's inspection. There was we had 3 supervisors in our barrack, block Hiltester. And one of them would stand at the front and say, "Mengele is coming!" And everybody would just, it's like some kind of a horror was entering. He would come very elegantly with his hands behind his back. He had his stick in his hand. He would hit it sometime against his riding boots and start counting. He always had at least 6 people with him, many times as many as 8 or 10. It was a big entourage. I was injected with something that made me very ill. That was sometime in June. After one of the visits to the lab, I became extremely ill. There were two kinds of labs, and that's another very long story in itself. One lab I call the blood lab, because basically what they did, they would tie both hands with the rubber hose, and then from this arm they would take a lot of blood. On occasion, 5-6 vials to see how much blood a person can lose and still live. In this arm, they would give shots. 4, 5, 6. I usually could count 5 needles going into my arm. My way of coping with it was to turn my head away and just wait for it to end. Next visit to the lab, I tried very hard to hide the fact that I was ill. But instead of tying my arms, they took me to a side room and measured my fever. And I knew I was in trouble. I was taken to the hospital, put into a barrack that I have not met many other people who have been in. I call it the barrack of the living dead. I was put in a small room with 2 other twins, who were a little bit older than me. And they explained to me that we do not get any food here, because this barrack is not even allocated the minimum food that the rest of the barracks are. That evening, Mengele came in with 5 other doctors, looked at my fever chart, never examined me, never ran any test, and declared, laughing, "Too bad, she's so young."
One of the most horrific experiments that Mengele did was to try and change the colour of people's eyes by injecting dye into their eyes without any anaesthetic. You can imagine the pain on that. Why? Because he thought that people with blue eyes were racially more pure than people who didn't have blue eyes. Well, the idea that you just inject someone with blue dye into their eyes and that's going to kind of make them better, it's clearly insane, and it has to be seen as sadism rather than anything medically useful. What he would also do would carry out sterilizations, often without anaesthetic, because he just wanted to try and see what was the quickest way of sterilizing women who were racially impure. If you could make lots and lots of women sterile very, very quickly, that was going to be a really good thing for the Nazis to do to stop all these people from reproducing. In a very grim way, what Mengele thought he was doing was completely correct. And what he has in a place like Auschwitz is living human material he can experiment on. Under normal circumstances, no, you're not experimenting on living human beings, but these people are largely Jews, they're not worthy of life. And so if you no longer see these beings as human beings, it becomes very easy for someone like Mengele just to think of them as, like kind of lab rats.
I was with other, I had to think, were twins. My visits to the hospital, I don't think were anywhere near as frequent as Irene's, and I don't remember ever being invaded into my body. The only thing I remember them doing to me is measuring, and I do remember the Röntgen, the X-ray, I guess it was, Röntgen. I remember that name, they used Röntgen a lot, and had to stand still or sit still for a very long time for this process to take place, and it was cold wherever you were. But that was just about the experience with the hospital, very minimal compared to Irene's.
We saw the children in the camp where Mengele used to experiment with him. There was a period of time when I used to clean in the barracks. Not very long, maybe 4 weeks or 6 weeks, I forgot, where I used to clean the barracks. So this was visible within the camp. But again, I don't think a lot of people took notice of it because everybody tried to survive. So you didn't worry about somebody else's problems. besides, you couldn't do nothing about it anyway. You know, you lived under dictatorship. You were just a number, not a person.
There's this very, very grim example in which Mengele is discussing with some of his fellow Nazi doctors one evening in Auschwitz what disease a teenage boy has. And Mengele is saying it's one sort of disease, and the other doctors are saying it's a different sort of disease. And Mengele is saying, no, I'm absolutely right, it's definitely this. And they say, well, okay, well, how are you going to find out? Mengele comes back 20 minutes later and says, oh, I dissected him, you guys were right. And these other doctors, turn around and they realise what Mengele's done in that 20 minutes. He's gone out the room, killed this boy, dissected his still warm body, come back in, and then said, now I know, and then carries on with the evening. I mean, it beggars belief that you could just go murder someone, dissect them, and then just carry on having a nice time. And it's just almost to prove, you're right or wrong. It's nuts.
Well, in fact, I just lost it. I used to carry this in my pocket. I never left my pocket. Something happened. I have a thing which says on it, I remember times when death was a luxury. And if I got a little upset over something, I used to just feel my pocket and feel as happy as can be, but there are no problems for me. And what it was is basically that you saw dead people, literally same dead, you walk by and say, boy, you don't have to suffer anymore. So dying was not easy. Even in concentration camp, I'm talking natural dying. Hunger was a terrible death, terrible death. Sickness was a terrible death. When you went into the crematorium, well, you had no choice. You went in there, and of course, a couple seconds later, you were dead. But people that slowly died. So basically, and I used this a lot of times. I remember times when death was a luxury, which literally you envied the people that were dead. You envied them. I done it many times. Many times. Because he no longer has to go through this ordeal. He doesn't have to suffer, he's finished. So dying was a luxury.
One of the reasons why Mengele becomes this really kind of notorious figure is because he does manage to escape after the war. When the Russians come to Auschwitz in January 1945, yes, they find a load of kind of living skeletons, if you like, but what they don't do is find people like Josef Mengele, because he's got out. He knows what he's done is wrong, otherwise why would he want to escape? So he lives in hiding in Germany until 1949, and then he eventually escapes to South America, where he spends the rest of his days until 1979, when he drowns, probably has a stroke, off a beach in Brazil. He never faces justice. What's really chilling about Mengele is that throughout the rest of his life, he always would justify what he had done in Auschwitz. He had always thought he had done the morally correct thing. And in fact, he meets his son, Rolf, in 1977. This is 2 years now before Mengele dies, and he's in his late 60s. And Rolf starts asking questions. Look, Dad, why did you do this in Auschwitz? Why did you experiment with people? Why did you kill people? And Mengele would go through to two different stages. First of all, he would kind of deny that he had done many of the things that the people said he had done. And frankly, there may have been slightly an element of truth to that, because there was an enormous amount of mythologizing of what Mengele did. But when he would admit to doing some of the things, he said to Rolf, his son, I've done nothing wrong. I was saving lives in Auschwitz. I wasn't ending them. And he would see his work on the selection ramps, for starters, saying to people, well, you're going to live and you're going to die. We see that as sending people to their deaths. Mengele saw that as sending people to their continued life, because he had this attitude that everybody there was going to die anyway. So in fact, he was kind of delaying their deaths. He was being the nice guy. And he also would say that the experiments he did were for the good of humanity, that this was an essential role of medicine, was to experiment on people. It is totally possible, of course, that Mengele, deep down in his deep, dark heart knew what he had done was completely amoral and completely wrong, and perhaps he could never admit it to himself. If that's the case, it showed an enormous amount of moral cowardice.
For some people, you feel if you see the picture, then you see you're lucky that you're alive, that you're able to see a few good years in front of you or good years behind you after concentration camp. Some people live with a guilt feeling that not heroic at all. They feel, why did I survive? And all this are dead, a lot of people. And there's a lot of people that have this problem today.
Sometimes when I remembered, I still have this horrible guilt with my mother and the pain why I'm alive and she's dead, but we survived.
I thought I was the only one. In fact, it's interesting, when in 1985, when we first found out there were other twins who survived Auschwitz, I said to Renee, I thought we were the only kids who survived. How could there be anybody else? What do you mean there are twins?
In all these bad things, there was still one pretty lucky thing, that this monster of a doctor was interested in experiments on twins. If he wouldn't have been interested in experiments, I wouldn't be here to tell you my story. So in all that crazy, crazy, miserable place, I have to look at it as still some strange stroke of luck, that at least I had a little chance to survive.